Chapter 10. Stalking Techniques. After successfully following the sign for several kilometers, or in some military situations, several days, it would be frustrating and dangerous to alert the quarry of your presence before you are ready. To that end, this chapter will demonstrate the practical expertise the tracker has to gain so that he can covertly approach his quarry in the final stages of the pursuit. Stalking is no longer natural to humans. It needs the study and practice of techniques. The actual practice is often difficult and uncomfortable as you crawl across rough ground and through tangled, spiky vegetation. The tracker stalker's progress. The methods of movement available to the stalker approaching his quarry will be described in detail later in this chapter. Cover can be very scant or non-existent, but by judicious route planning, the stalker will make use of every crease and fold in the ground to approach his quarry. This approach will probably not be direct because it is following the best cover. With practice, it is possible to move at a reasonable speed in comparative silence, steadily and carefully. As the tracker stalker moves, his gaze continually sweeps far and near, right and left, up and down, looking not only at bushes and trees, but through and beyond them. He disregards the general pattern of foliage. The untrained stalker usually looks at a bush, failing to see what is behind or in it. The tracker is conscious that completely new arcs of visibility are opening up in which the quarry may be waiting. To inspect the ground, the tracker stops, goes down on one knee, waits for the cover man if he is a military tracker, and only then lowers his head to look at the ground. Whether the tracker is stationary or moving, only his eyes are ever directed towards the ground. He doesn't lower his head in order to look at the sign. This is especially important while he is moving forward. He crouches down occasionally, as this often provides a better view through the vegetation, especially in what is termed close country, such as you find in secondary jungle. When working through woods and undergrowth, don't brush through the small bushes, but slowly lift them aside with your hand and then ease them back into place. Don't let them spring back. This technique not only cuts out a great deal of noise, but it also eliminates unnecessary movement of the vegetation. Do not grab branches, saplings, or bushes for extra support, leverage, or balance when crossing an obstacle, getting up off the ground, or when climbing a hill, because the slightest movement at the base is magnified at the top. This movement will give your position away. Flag waving or telegraphing is the term given to this phenomenon, and the message is translated in all directions, not just forward. Avoid treading on dry leaves, sticks, or rotten wood. Don't allow yourself to become caught up in vines or overhanging creepers, and, if you are, remove any spiky trailing fronds carefully and silently from your clothing. If you think you have been spotted or you have been caught out in the open, remain perfectly still, freeze until your quarry turns its head away, then move slowly and quietly back into cover. Even when right out in the open, there is no cause for alarm provided your background harmonizes with your clothes, and you remain perfectly motionless. You will certainly arouse suspicion and probably alarm if you disappear suddenly. The only time when rapid movement back into cover is recommended is when it is a human who has surprised you. Even the circumstances will dictate whether to freeze or flee, but if you move, any other animal will instantly be put to flight. There is a specific technique to freezing, which again I will describe later. Generally speaking, in stalking, trying to avoid working with the sun in your face, especially when the sun is low on the horizon in the morning or in the evening. There are several reasons for this. First, it is difficult to distinguish an object in the distance with the sun in your eyes. Second, it is easier for the quarry to spot you with the sun shining on your clothes. Unfortunately, owing to a natural paradox, it is easier to make out a track with the sun shining towards you, casting a shadow on the track. Listening halts. As the tracker approaches his quarry and the skills of stalking come into play, it is essential to take listening halts. You and your team should not make any noise that will travel beyond the distance you can see. Otherwise, the quarry or enemy may be aware of you before you see them. Listening halts should be taken frequently. The tracker and his team should remain perfectly still and position themselves low down in shadow or shade, and against an appropriate background. Otherwise, the slightest movement on your part will attract attention. To listen most effectively, it is necessary to cock your head in the direction where you are listening, and to open your mouth slightly, as this aids the working of the hearing function. Stalking skills. If one word should be remembered by a stalker, it is stealthily. This word exactly describes the mode of progress that should be adopted. The actual method, walking, crawling, or slithering, varies according to the distance you are from your quarry and the kind of country you're moving through, but all the time you must use cunning and move stealthily. I will now detail the different methods used by the tracker on his final approach, the stalk. The cautious approach. This merely consists of walking calmly and quietly in the direction of the supposed quarry or in a direction you consider favorable to your purpose, having taken into account all aspects of the environment, including the terrain, obstacles, and the wind direction. You have not come to grips with the quarry yet, but there is no knowing when you may come to close quarters, and so you have to be wary and take advantage of rising ground, of dips, of the cover afforded by trees and bushes, or the bed of a stream. Even this requires practice and an eye for ground, so that any casual observation does not lead you along a wrong line that will suddenly expose you to the view of everybody and everything within miles. The upright crouch. When you're getting within range, your approach must be made still more cautiously. It is best to adopt what is known as the upright crouching position, figure 20. This requires practice in lifting the feet and in balance. The feet should point straight forward to offer the least resistance to any obstacles that may be encountered. If the toes turn out, they act as hooks. The knees should be kept slightly bent and relaxed. The feet should be lifted well off the ground at every step and not shuffled along. Walk slowly and watch the placement of your feet. Tread on the outside of your foot first and roll your foot on and off the ground. Be ready to withdraw the foot should it come into contact with anything likely to make noise. The ball of the foot should touch the ground first, followed by the heel. The weight of the body should be placed gradually on the sole of the foot to avoid snapping any twig that may be underneath it or kicking any stones. A firm balance should be obtained on each leg in turn before the other is advanced, so that at any moment, in any place, and in any position, you can remain poised like a statue and as quiet. At the same time, the arms should be kept still as you move and not be swung about violently. Every movement should be stealthy, silent, and deliberate. In fact, you must put your brain into the soles of your feet and your eyes into your toes as you feel your way along. The best place to start to practice is a small wood or thicket strewn with dry leaves and sticks. To feel the ground better, your thin-soled shoes or just thick socks, depending on the surface in your feet. You can even try stalking barefoot to achieve greater sensitivity. The feline crawl. When the distance between you and your quarry is lessening and when cover is getting scarce, it will be necessary to employ the feline crawl, figure 21. Any domestic cat can demonstrate this method to you. Watch a cat, study its methods, and copy them. The cat family is probably the best at stalking. The hind paws come automatically up to the position that the corresponding front paw has occupied. You have to crawl along on hands and knees. The hands feel for suitable places on which to rest, and the corresponding knee comes up to the same position. Care should be taken to lift the knee and foot from the ground and not to drag them, but equal care should be exercised so that the feet are not waved in the air. Also, do not hump the body in the middle like a camel. Keep the back low. The head should be the highest part, and that too should be kept as low as possible and certainly not bobbed or suddenly or jerked from side to side. As before, every movement that is made should be slow and deliberate. The flat or belly crawl. Lastly, there is the flat crawl, figure 22. This procedure is used for the final stage of the stalk. It is slow and very tiring, especially for the abdominal muscles. It is necessary to go down full length on the ground, flat on the abdomen with the head down. The body and legs should be kept stiff and the legs close together. The toes should be turned well out and the heels kept down so that practically the whole of the inner side of the foot rests upon the ground. If this is not done consciously, there is a tendency for the feet to come up and attract attention. You now have to work yourself forward bit by bit, a few inches at a time, using the hands and the sides of the feet. This can be done by placing your forearm flat on the ground in front of your head and by bringing the other forearm up in front of it, and so on, the toes being used as levers on which to work. Instead of using the forearms, it is possible to move forward by placing the hands on the ground close to, almost under the body, on a level of the chest, and pulling yourself forward with them. Care should be taken to keep the elbows well down and close to the sides. If it is safe to expose the head sufficiently to look around, then it is possible to do the flat crawl more on the side than on the stomach, and to bend the knees sideways to bring them up to help. Your movements will then be something of a cross between a feline crawl and a flat crawl. With all methods of movement, the stalker must be aware of the vegetation above and around him. If he is not careful with his movements, the grass and bushes will telegraph his progress towards the quarry. Freezing. Frequently, you find that when you are stalking, even when going dead slow, you suddenly burst out of cover and are liable to be spotted. In that case, there is only one thing to do. You must freeze instantly, and when the opportunity offers, slowly and carefully work back to cover again, remembering that any sudden movement is liable to give you away. In these circumstances, it is best to crawl backwards, keeping your body and legs stiff, and levering yourself back with your toes and hands working together. At the same time, your face and hands should be kept close to the ground and steady. Even when back and cover, be very cautious about raising your head. The art of freezing was touched upon earlier. It is not necessary to be behind something to remain unobserved. If there is a suitable background, it is possible to assume a position right out in the open without any danger of being noticed, provided you keep your body, limbs, and especially your head still. This technique needs a good deal of practice so that whatever method of stalking you are using, you can instantly become still and then remain motionless for a considerable period. Although this technique is most effective with the non-human quarry, it has its place in the repertoire of skills to be used when stalking a human, although then the background, distance, and light conditions are more critical. Canadian hunters lay great emphasis on the best prone pose to adopt when freezing during a stalk. They not only remain motionless, but they adopt a pose which reflects the character of the surrounding trees, bushes, and rocks. Thus, among perfectly straight trees, they would stand erect, whereas in an area with many uprooted trees, they would adopt a more irregular pose by bending and twisting their body and arms. Obviously, they slowly and cautiously take up these shapes. They don't snap into them. Lying still. The practice of lying or sitting perfectly still during the day or at night, and letting the wildlife in an area become used to your presence, enables you to learn a great deal about what is happening. The novice will be amazed how the wildlife starts to return and totally ignores you if you stay still for a long period. I've been fortunate enough to see some remarkable sights as I've lain perfectly motionless for hours in observation or sentry positions. Vibrantly colored hummingbirds, within arm's length, beating their wings at a rate that defies the eyes as they hover to draw out the nectar from jungle flowers. Vixens bringing out their cubs to play by the safety of the den entrance. A sophisticated version of this habit takes place in the blind the bird photographer constructs. The detailed subject of hides is beyond the scope of this book, but it should be noted by the serious student of tracking that a hide acts as a good observation post for any individual who desires to study nature. Tree hides can also be effective, provided the observer realizes he is not hidden when he sits across a branch. He must conform to the lines of the tree. Route planning. Apart from the techniques of moving silently and covertly, another very pertinent subject is often overlooked entirely by the amateur, and that is route planning and selection, figure 23. When given a target to stalk, military snipers are also issued aerial photography and stereoscopes so that they can plan the approach to the enemy with meticulous precision. Chapter 20 is devoted to the associated skills of map reading. The route will seldom be the most direct, but the experienced tracker will take all the following points into consideration before embarking on the final stage of the pursuit. Wind direction and strength. We know the wind carries not only smell but also sound, therefore you should stalk with the wind in your face. Vegetation. As vegetation cover alters, the stalker has to select new material to top up his personal camouflage. Movement. Each leg of the stalk will require a different method of movement. It is useful to split the route into bounds. hence the expression to move in bounds. See the numbers in Figure 23. For instance, if you are behind a hedge and not visible from the quarry, a crouching posture will be ideal, whereas if you are working your way through a wheat field overlooked by the quarry, it will be necessary to adopt a feline crawl. Landmarks. During the stalk, you will require reference points for orientation purposes. These must be visible without exposing yourself, for example, towers, trees, high ground, the sun, moon, and stars. Cover. Check that the obvious features, such as ditches, walls, hedges, buildings, riverbeds, will actually cover you to your destination and that the cover is complete. Many hedges have gaps in them and ditches can terminate abruptly in impassably small drainage pipes. Dead ground. This is a military term used to describe an area that, although overlooked by an observer, is a blind spot to him because of the folds in the ground. It is of great importance to the stalker. He can move through such areas with impunity because he is out of sight. To the inexperienced stalker, it can be unnerving in dead ground and open country as he feels completely exposed, but it is far safer than following a broken hedge in full sight of the target. Of course, you may have to consider the wind and scent. Obstacles. The route planning has to take into account any obstacles before the stalker sets off. He should have a good idea in his mind as to how he will overcome each and every obstacle. A prime consideration in obstacle crossing is skylining. Avoid it, but if it is unavoidable, do it briefly, keep as low as possible, and, for example, roll away from the crest of a hill. Roads and waterways. Plan to cross these at bends or corners. Plowed land. Use the furrows as cover. Long grass and cereal crops. Keep changing direction so there isn't a uniform, predictable movement of the foliage causing color change. Observation points. There should be pre-planned points at which you will halt and observe the quarry. This is necessary in case the animal has moved or the human quarry is planning any actions that could affect you. It is imperative that you can see without being seen, so pick observation points that allow you to look through cover rather than over it. Noise. The stalker has to take advantage of existing noises such as streams, wind, rain, vehicles, the sea, or aircraft to cover any sound that he may make. He should ensure that the contents of his pockets and any equipment that he is carrying do not make any sound that will carry. Before a stalker, this can easily be checked by jumping up and down a few times. The stalker selects his clothing with the elimination of noise in mind because many fabrics, especially waterproof ones, rustle when in contact with vegetation. Watches that chime or beep should be left behind, along with pagers, mini cassette recorders, and mobile phones. Remember that sound travels in all directions. Visibility in close country can be very limited, so the visual tracker must ensure that sounds made will not travel beyond the distance he can see. Thus, he will avoid alerting an unsuspecting quarry of his approach. Silence is essential at all times. All extraneous noise has to be excluded. This refers both to voice and movement. Because the tracker has to eliminate all sounds, military trackers have developed a series of hand signals for communicating within their group. Animals. As previously mentioned, any wildlife that you disturb will alert the quarry, and the curiosity of domesticated animals will, apart from the more obvious barking of dogs, be noticed by the observant enemy. Hillsides. If you're stalking on a mountain or a hillside, try to put yourself into a position above the quarry but avoid skylining. Animals tend to look for danger coming from below. On mountains, the stalker has to avoid displacing rocks. Stalking animals. Grazing animals tend to raise their heads at frequent but irregular intervals, so do not be tempted to make a sudden dash or any quick movement, as you can be caught out and they will be put to flight. Alternative routes. After choosing the main route, consider other paths in case you have to abort or modify the stalk for reasons such as a change in the wind direction, movement of the quarry, or third-party interference. Hand signals. The hand signals military trackers use are a refinement of infantry hand signals. Such is their importance that trackers always rehearse them immediately before a patrol. The group may have its own variations relevant to that particular theater of operations. The number of silent hand signals is kept to a minimum so as to avoid confusion. Remember, these are being used to communicate vital, perhaps life-saving information. at a time when the patrol is within hearing distance of the enemy. See Figure 24 for some of the more common hand signals used. The tracking stalking group. The tracker has to be aware that he must control the group he is with. He either does this himself or the commander of the group is mindful of the tracker's work and manages his role. The party has to be controlled for the following reasons. Silence is paramount. Preservation of the sign. The tracker's group must not inadvertently spoil the sign. Exercises and practices for the instructor. Stalking is usually associated with the wilds, with big game hunting, and with deer stalking, but is not necessary to have something very large to stalk. You can get a great deal of good experience stalking a dog, a cat, or any of the smaller wild animals such as rabbits. Before students are asked to undertake a stalk, they should be well practiced in adopting the different stalking positions and in moving across the ground by the different methods. Preparatory drills should include, at intervals, the instruction to freeze. Now we are able to undertake a full-scale stalking practice. To emphasize the seriousness of stalking, the students can be told that this exercise is based upon a test military snipers have to take. For the instructor, all that is required for this exercise is an observer or two with binoculars, controllers who walk near the students who are carrying out the stalk, a suitable piece of land, either private or where there are not likely to be any disturbances from other groups, and communications between the observer and the controllers. The students are briefed to the effect that they have a start point about 1,000 meters from the observer, boundaries in the area in which they can move, to get within 150 to 200 meters of the observer. Rough limits should be outlined by the controller as to the extent of this bracket. To be in a position to observe the quarry from their chosen position. A time limit, approximately 45 to 60 minutes. The students then attempt to accomplish the task. The controllers stay within sight of the stalkers, but as far from them as possible. It is best if there is a controller for each stalker, as the stalkers may take very different routes to the target. When the observers think they have seen any of the stalkers, they radio the controllers and direct them to where they think there is a stalker. The controller does not aid the observer or the stalker. When the student is in position, he declares it to the nearest controller. The controller then moves within 10 meters of the stalker and tells the observer that he has 3 minutes to locate the stalker. If he is unsuccessful, the controller moves to within 5 meters and the procedure is repeated, and then finally to within arm's length. The outdoor pursuits instructor can switch the roles for the students by letting them be observers and controllers in turn so as to see the problems from another standpoint. The type of terrain chosen is a very important consideration. To avoid discouraging the student in the early stages, the mission should be achievable. At the group's level of expertise increases, the stalking problems can be made more difficult. If the debriefs, they will soon realize the golden rule of stalking. You take your risks early in a stalk, when the target is further away. As a rule, the nearer you are to the quarry, the lower and slower you need to be. The stalking practice above will impress upon the tracking student the patience, planning, and skill required to carry out a successful stalk. To summarize, routes must be planned. Avoid impassable obstacles, marshes, open ground. Move in bounds. Keep a check on your course. Observe without being seen. Remember the golden rule of stalking. Take risks early. Summary. Stalking. If one word should be remembered by a stalker, it is stealthily. Methods of movement. The cautious approach. This consists of walking calmly and quietly. The upright crouch. The ball of the foot should touch the ground first, followed by the heel. The feline crawl. When the distance between you and your quarry is lessening and when your cover is getting scarce, it will be necessary to employ the feline crawl. You crawl along on hands and knees. The hands feel for suitable places on which to rest, and the corresponding knee comes up to the same position. The flat or belly crawl. This procedure is used for the final stage of the stalk. It is necessary to go down full length on the ground, flat on the abdomen, with the head down. You work yourself forward bit by bit, a few inches at a time, using the hands and the sides of the feet. Freezing. Used if you are liable to be spotted. This technique is most effective with a non-human quarry. It does have a place in the repertoire of skills to be used when stalking a human, although then the background, distance, and light conditions are more critical. Route planning and the stalk. Wind direction and strength. As we know, the wind carries not only smell but also sound. Therefore, you should stalk with the wind in your face. Vegetation. As the vegetation cover alters, the stalker has to select new material to top up his personal camouflage. Movement. Each leg of the stalk will probably require a different method of movement. For instance, if you are behind a hedge and not visible from quarry, a crouching posture will be ideal. Whereas if you are working your way through a wheat field overlooked by the quarry, it will be necessary to adopt the feline crawl. Divide the route into bounds. Landmarks. During the stalk, you will require reference points for orientation purposes. Cover. Check that the obvious features such as ditches, walls, hedges, buildings, and riverbeds will actually cover you to your destination and that the ground is complete. I should say the cover is complete. Dead ground. This is a military term used to describe an area that, although overlooked by an observer, is a blind spot to him because of the folds in the ground. Obstacles. The route planning has to take into account any obstacles before the stalker sets off. Roads and waterways. Try to plan to cross roads and waterways at bends or corners. Plowed land. Use the furrows as cover. Long grass or cereal crops. Keep changing directions so there isn't a uniform, predictable movement of the foliage causing color change. Observation points. There should be pre-planned points at which you will halt and observe the quarry. Noise. The stalker has to take advantage of existing noises such as streams, the wind, rain, vehicles, the sea, or aircraft to cover any sounds that he may make. Animals. Any wildlife that you disturb will alert the quarry. The curiosity of domesticated animals will, apart from the more obvious barking of dogs, be noticed by the observant enemy. Hillsides. If you're stalking on a mountain or hillside, try to put yourself into a position above the quarry, but avoid skylining. Stalking animals. Grazing animals tend to raise their heads at frequent but irregular intervals, so do not be tempted to make a sudden dash or any quick movements, as you can be caught out and they will be put to flight. Alternative routes. After choosing the main route, consider other paths in case you have to abort or modify the stalk. Rehearse hand signals. Control the tracking group. The tracker has to be aware that he must control the group that he is with. The golden rule of stalking. Take risks early.